before we begin, I'll ask if David wouldn't mind leading us in a word of prayer, please.
Our Father, we're thankful for this beautiful morning, and especially now that we can study more of your word. We pray this morning as you lead, we will receive direction our class, and help us as much listen and better understand your word. We also pray for the ones that are not feeling well, can't be out today. We pray that you will help them get stronger and soon be able to come back with us if this will. Pray now that you will be with us in our study together.
Amen. Thank you, David. Well, first of all, I just want to say how appreciative I am to have had the summer off of teaching and to listen to all of y'all, your lessons and your perspectives. It is really impressive that there's so many people here that are willing to share that load over a quarter or over any time. And of course, Judges is not an easy book, and so I've appreciated all of the lessons that come from that. We look at it and we think, oh, that's a pretty easy book, until you start really studying it and you think, ooh, what's wrong with these people? And that's pretty much where we are today with Jephthah. Jephthah is my, I don't know how to say this. I haven't taught a lesson on Jephthah in about 16 years. I remember the last time I taught it, and I thought, I don't think I'm going to do that for a while. And I think you can understand why. It's a difficult thing. It's one of the most disturbing, not quite the most disturbing story in the Scriptures. Not even the most disturbing story in the book of Judges, to be honest with you. That comes later, in my opinion, towards the end. But it is a disturbing story, and as we have noticed going through these, now, and another interesting thing that we see is the first Judges, up to Deborah and Barak or so, we have folks that are are generically pretty good folks. But then after Deborah, you kind of get some people that you wouldn't want to emulate. And in fact, we shouldn't want to emulate anybody except for their faith. If someone has faith, then we want to see that and model ourselves after that kind of thing. And as Paul says, if you remember, imitate me or follow me as I do what? As I follow Christ. So the Bible is less about taking these men and these women that God tells us and teaches us about and turning them into our heroes, and more about showing us that you're going to have flaws, you're going to sin. That's part of the deal. But it only takes a little bit of faith, and God will work with you. In fact, that's what Jesus says, isn't it? How big of faith do we need to have? Does you remember what size of what? A mustard seed. Now, sometimes we'll look at that and we'll stumble and we'll fall, and we'll say, and at least I do, I'll think, good grief, I don't even have the faith the size of a mustard seed. I'm in pretty crummy shape. But that's not what Jesus is wanting us to see. He's wanting us to see it's not about the size of your faith. The mustard seed is not very big. It's the size of the God that you're putting your faith in. And so that is really a big portion of what we're going to see even in Jephthah. Now, the lesson today covers chapter 11, towards the end of chapter 11 there, 11:29, and it's going to go all the way through chapter 12, the entirety of that chapter down through verse 15. And so we've already seen, Bill talked about it last week, Jephthah delivered Israel, but he's not done. He has had a victory. He's not done with some things. So we're going to look at the next several verses. Let's read down through the end of this chapter, and then we'll go back and talk about, I don't know where that came from, talk about some things. I must have been my Australian accent trying to sneak out. It says, and the Spirit of the Lord was upon Jephthah. Okay, that's an important line. The Spirit of the Lord was upon Jephthah. We've already seen it a couple of times. And starting next week, when we start looking at Samson, we're going to see it more and more. Samson is really the last of the big judges, and then after Samson, it all just kind of falls apart. But Samson will have the Spirit of the Lord move him and be upon him. The same wording is here with Jephthah. Now, it says, and he passed through Gilead and Manasseh, and passed on to Mizpah of Gilead. And from Mizpah of Gilead he passed on to the Ammonites. And Jephthah made a vow to the Lord, and said, if you will give the Ammonites into my hand, then whatever comes out from the doors of my house to meet me when I return in peace from the Ammonites shall be the Lord's, and I will offer it up for burnt offering. So Jephthah crossed over to the Ammonites to fight against them. The Lord gave them into his hand. And he struck them from Aroer to the neighborhood of Minnith, 20 cities, and as far as Abel-Keramim, with a great blow. So the Ammonites were subdued before the people of Israel. Then Jephthah came to his home at Mizpah, and behold, his daughter came out to meet him with tambourines and with dances. She was his only child. Besides her, he had neither son nor daughter. And as soon as he saw her, he tore his clothes and said, alas, my daughter, you have brought me very low, and you have become the cause of great trouble to me. For I have opened my mouth to the Lord, and I cannot take back my vow. And she said to him, my father, you have opened your mouth to the Lord. Do to me according to what has gone out of your mouth. Now that the Lord has avenged you on your enemies, on the Ammonites. So she said to her father, let this thing be done for me. Leave me alone 2 months, that I may go up and down on the mountains and weep for my virginity, I and my companions. So he said, go. Then he sent her away for 2 months, and she departed. She and her companions wept for her virginity on the mountains, and at the end of 2 months she returned to her father, who did with her according to his vow that he had made. She had never known a man, and it became a custom in Israel that the daughters of Israel went year by year to lament the daughter of Jephthah, the Gileadite, 4 days in the year. All right, so obviously we're going to focus on the vow, and vow making, vow keeping, what laws were there about vows, and we're going to get into something that people have been debating for a while about this, because it's a pretty difficult passage. So before we do get into any of that, does anybody have any questions about this passage? Or maybe you have some comments or insights, or maybe there's something that really just popped up at you that you want to make sure we cover. I do fall asleep quickly, so if there's anything out there.
Kind of like Baal worship, where they killed their kids, you know.
Yep, you brought up a very good point there. Yes, we're gonna.
This is exactly what he did.
Yes, we're actually going to cover that. That's a good observation. If y'all can hear that, Sarah brought up that this is like Baal worship. That's not what God wanted ever, and here is Jephthah doing this, and so you got to wonder. So for one thing, Jephthah's already, if memory serves me correctly, Jephthah's already had a victory, right? In chapter 11, earlier in chapter 11, and so. Or at least God's already told him. And here's the thing, of course, we have to be careful, but not too careful, because we're living thousands of years in advance. You know, we have the entirety of the Word of God complete before us. We're able to look at this. We have hindsight. It's easier to be what do they call it, a Monday morning quarterback, and when you're not in the thick of it, it's easier to say, well, this is what I would have done. Maybe you would have, maybe you wouldn't have. They also are a completely different culture, so we've got to be careful with that. We also need to realize, however, that they did not have very much of the Word of God at all, and it may not have been. We don't know the level of how much it was being taught. They would have had the law, probably Joshua to a degree, maybe not. That might have been written later. Doesn't mean Joshua wrote the book of Joshua. Some people think he did. Some people think he didn't. Ruth would not have been written because Ruth takes place during the Judges. So they don't have much. This is pre-King David and all of that. So all they have is the law. But what we do know is that even though they have the law, Israel is in this terrible cycle of disobeying God. In fact, what's the first two commandments of the law? Don't worship any other god besides me. Number 1 and 2 are pretty much cousins, sisters, I guess you could call them. The other one is what? You shall make no graven image. And what do we see Israel doing here throughout the whole book of Judges? Exactly that. The whole time. This is actually Israel's biggest temptation throughout their history in the Old Testament, is to worship other gods. And it starts off all the way back when Moses is on the mountain receiving the law of God, which they had already heard, by the way. We don't want to miss that. God had gathered all the people to the mountain there at Sinai, and they did all of their rituals to purify themselves so that they could approach the mountain. They could not touch the mountain. If they touched the mountain, they were to be killed. And so the whole nation gathered around Mount Sinai. God comes down. They see all this. He comes down in thunder and fire, and he gives them the 10 Commandments verbally. They hear it with their ears. They are scared to death. That's why Moses goes up on the mountain for 40 days, because they said, Moses, if we hear God's voice anymore, we're all going to die. So you go up for us. And so that's what he did. While he's up there, on the other hand, the people are thinking something terrible has happened to Moses. We're without our guide and our shepherd. Let's build ourselves a what? A golden calf. Where would they have gotten such an idea? I mean, that seems Egypt, yes. It's very specific. So if you go back to Egyptian history, you'll notice that they have at least 2 different cow gods. It sounds weird. That they worshipped. I'm not sure which one it was, if this was if it was either of them or they were just inspired. But they did, and here's the kicker. They actually said that the name of the calf was, this is the Lord who delivered us. Well, remember, when you see the word Lord like that in the scriptures, that's being used. So, because it was, later on they took out the name of God, Yahweh, and put in Lord. So they're actually calling the calf after God. All kinds of things going on there that should not be going on. And this starts a cycle of Israel being disobedient to God, and they begin worshiping these things. Now, what David will say in the Psalms is that those who worship idols will become like the idols that they worship. So the lesson there is, whatever we worship, we're going to become like that. And that makes sense, because we're setting it up higher than us, and we are, if we set something higher than ourselves, that's what we seek to attain. So if we're worshiping the God of the Bible, then we're going to become more godly. If we're worshiping Satan, on the other hand, well, we're going to become more evil. Now, Jephthah, and Sarah brought up the Baal thing. We're going to talk about that here in a second. Jephthah is in the middle here, towards the end of all of these things. And so he could have gone back. The history would have been there. Of course, they had things every 30, 40 years of a cycle. And one way that we are able to go back and see the faithfulness of God is to go back and see the faithfulness of God. That seems so simple. How do we know that God's going to be faithful to his promises today? Because he always has been. He's never broken his faithfulness. And so when we look at the scriptures today and the things that God builds upon his promise, if we have faith and are baptized, and that means that we've given ourselves to the Lord, he's saved us. When he says, I'm sending my son back, some will scoff at that idea. They are scoffing at that idea. But he's always been faithful before. We just don't know when. And so we continue to believe he's going to send Jesus back. And so Jephthah could have looked at the men before him and the women, Deborah, and saw that God was faithful. And what he does, in fact, when someone makes a vow to the Lord, and that's in that kind of situation, not all vows. Paul makes a vow in the New Testament. There are some other vows that people make that are not like what Jephthah does. But when someone makes a rash vow like this, what might be their purpose behind it? Exactly. It doesn't necessarily trust the Lord. So if I give you something that's precious to me, maybe the Lord will really deliver me. So that's but at the same time, Jephthah is mentioned for his faith. So he has faith, but he struggles with it. Now, I want to ask another question. This one's a little more difficult, and it's not controversial yet. What did he expect was going to come out of his house? I mean, we have a different culture. If I say something's going to come out of my house, it could be a dog. It better not be, because it's probably going to run off and then we're going to have to chase it. It could be a dog. More than likely, it's going to be Hope or Hannah. The boys are probably in there hanging out doing something. We're like, oh, Dad's home? Like half an hour later. Hope or Hannah would be the first things coming out, first people that came out. Now, we do have a different situation. Some people have wanted to say, and they try to make the connection, well, Jephthah probably thought that an animal was going to come out, burnt offering, an animal type of thing. Now, so if you go back to that kind of idea, and let's play with that for a few minutes. The Israelites had courtyards where their animals would stay. Now, and I have heard people say, well, they would bring in their animals into their house. That wasn't really an Israelite thing, from what I've been able to find. Some have said that it probably was, but I've never found any hard evidence for that. That did happen in medieval times in Europe. People would bring their animals. They'd have their houses built up, and part of the house would be underneath, and they would have their animals underneath. They weren't really in the house, living quarters, but they'd be there. So maybe Jephthah had something like that. That's kind of a stretch. They did have a courtyard, and that's where the animals would be. Typically, however, when you don't see very many animals coming out to greet you when you have arrived. I can think dogs, obviously, will do that. I've had 2 cats that would do that. As soon as they see me, they would be all over me and even wait at the door. So animals can do that, but sheep, that's what you're looking at here. Or cattle, typically, unless you have a really good relationship with your cows, they're probably not going to come out to see you. So what is it that he was expecting? Some have said, now this doesn't stop the disturbance, to me anyway. Some have said, well, Israelites had servants. And maybe he was expecting a servant to come out. That doesn't make any difference. I'm going to tell a story. This is kind of a disturbing story. And it happened within the last couple of months. In my previous town, I can't even give you the name of what they're calling this because it's so disgusting. There is a young man who is the grandson of a very important person. And he saw a man on the side of the road, and he filled up the jar with urine, and as he drove by, he threw it at the man. Nothing's been done. No arrests have been made. Nothing along those lines, even though it's been witnessed by several different people. And here's the thing that disturbed me the most. That's bad. That's very bad. Someone actually defended him and said, well, maybe he thought the person was homeless. What difference does that make? You see, that kind of shows maybe Jephthah did expect a servant to come out, but it doesn't make any difference. Because at the end of the day, whether you're a servant or whether you're a child of the person living there, we are all made in God's image. Whether you have a home or whether you've hit rock bottom and you don't have a home, you have been made in God's image, and therefore that deserves dignity and respect. So therefore, the idea that he might have been expecting a servant to come out of his house doesn't make me feel any better. It just makes me wonder what was going on inside this man's mind. He obviously doesn't trust the Lord's promise at this point. And I believe, as and scholars have brought this up, what Sarah brought up was Israel was so involved in the Canaanite culture that human sacrifice was not a problem. And so he was willing to sacrifice a human being that came out of his house, and thought that he was doing something for God. Now, someone might say, well, let's hold on a second here, because what does God do about Abraham? We're going to talk about this in our sermon here in a little bit. What about Abraham and Isaac? What does God tell Abraham to do with Isaac? To sacrifice him, right? And so we can go back to Genesis and we read that story. God commands it to be done. But the whole purpose of that was to really show Abraham. It was a test. When God tests people in the Bible, he's not testing them so God will know or God will figure out where they are. He's testing them so that that person will see where they are. Abraham has had a really hard row to hoe. I mean, think about it. Everything God had promised him way back when he was in his 60s or so, that he was going to have a son. He and Sarah were going to have a son. That doesn't happen. They constantly are trying to figure out ways to help God's promise along. That they feel like they've got to do something. God made the promise. We've got to make sure that the promise is fulfilled. So at first Abraham thinks maybe it will be his servant. It's not his servant. So then Sarah thinks, well, maybe if I give you my maid to be your concubine. Of course, they had this idea that if a woman received a child when it was being born on her knees, when the child was being born from his or her biological mother, then that woman was the official mother, the legal mother. So that's an interesting take on that as well, because then Ishmael, who is born of Hagar, becomes legally the son of Sarah, though we don't really see Sarah having much to do with Ishmael. But they thought that was the idea. And then, of course, many years after that, God says, Abraham, you and Sarah are going to have a baby next year. Sarah laughs. Abraham is shocked. He's going to be 100. She's going to be 90. And, of course, after Isaac is weaned, they have a shindig. They have a party. It was a big deal. And Ishmael was mocking or making fun of Isaac. And I think he was about 17 years old about that time. from what I've been able to pick up on. And that's old enough for a child to know not to pick on a toddler. So maybe there was something wrong with Ishmael's thought patterns. Maybe he was underdeveloped. I don't know. Or he was just mean. And so Sarah said, I don't want these people to have anything to do with my son. Send them away. And Sarah's already had some issues with Hagar because of Ishmael. And so Abraham sends Hagar and Ishmael away. Abraham loved Ishmael. He tells God that when God says, you're going to have another son. He says, but could it not just be Ishmael? And God says, no. So he loves Ishmael. But here's the interesting thing. How much food and water did he give Hagar and Ishmael? Only enough for a day. He was sending them out in the desert, only gave them enough for a day. That's weird. Abraham has lied about his wife on multiple occasions. The last occasion would have been within the 9 months, almost, of when Isaac could have been born. So he has really struggled with he still has faith. He believes God, he obeys God, but he still struggles. And so God gives him a test. And God never intended for that test to be finished. He never intended for Abraham to sacrifice Isaac to death. That was for Abraham to see that he was willing to do whatever God told him to do. I watched a little bit of this. There was a movie, I think back in the 70s or 60s called The Bible. I always thought that was interesting because I think it only covers the first book. But it does have Abraham in it. And we see Abraham just going crazy when God tells him to do this. But the Bible doesn't give us that indication. The Bible gives us the indication that Abraham believed God so much, when you turn over to the book of Hebrews, chapter 11, that Abraham believed God so much that Isaac was the child of promise, that even if Abraham were to kill Isaac, what would God do? Bring him back to life. Abraham had faith. The situation with Jephthah and the situation with Abraham are not the same. Then someone might say, what about Jesus, though? Now Jesus, God offered Jesus. All right. I've heard a lot of people talk about this kind of thing over the last couple of years, that Christianity is based on human sacrifice because the Father sacrificed his Son. It's based on child sacrifice. That's what I think we would call that a straw man. It's misrepresenting a stance to weaken your opponent, even though that is not what they believe or what they stand for. And so, I have heard that, and so someone said, well, God sacrificed Jesus. Here's a big difference there. Yes, God did send Jesus to be crucified. However, as we notice through the scriptures, whose choice was it? It was Jesus's. He willingly offered himself. At any point in time, Jesus could have said, that's enough. I'm not doing this. And he wouldn't have done it. We would have been lost forever. The world would have gone wildly even more out of control now then than it is now. Satan would have really won the day. I mean, everything would have been worse than we could ever even imagine. He could have called those legions of angels. He could have got down off the cross, but he willingly and humbly submitted himself to the point of death, even the death on the cross, as Paul says in Philippians. So that is completely different than what's going on here with Jephthah and his daughter. So then, the next thing I want to talk about, now, maybe one of the reasons that I don't like talking about Jephthah also is because one of my teachers actually went in this direction because it was just so horrible of an idea that someone would do this. So there has been a very long discussion among people Did he actually offer her as a burnt sacrifice, or did he consecrate her? There are arguments, obviously. They would not say that if they didn't think they had an argument. So I want us to talk about the view for a couple of minutes that she was consecrated and she had lifelong virginity rather than being offered as a burnt offering. And honestly, I would like to believe that. That sounds much better. I don't believe that that's what happened, though. And there are reasons within the text that I think discloses as to why that is not what happened. One reason that people will bring this up is because, of course, it is so disturbing. But there are also things in the not in the New Testament, but in the law that would have eliminated his need to do this. Now, not all of these laws are going to work out in Jephthah's case, but in Leviticus chapter 5, verses 4 through 6, there is an offering allowed for someone who makes thoughtless speech. If you make a vow that you shouldn't have made, that was dumb, you're going to have to pay. But you can make a sacrifice. Deuteronomy chapter 23, 21 through 23, really says, pretty much don't make those vows. That's what Jesus says, right? What's Jesus say about vow making? Don't do it. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. I remember when I was a little boy and we would watch the inauguration of the presidents. I remember President Reagan and, of course, Bush, Clinton, Bush. I was too little for I wasn't even around for Kennedy, for Carter. But every time they would swear on the Bible, my mom would get so frustrated. And she'd just say, well, the Bible says let your yeses be yes and let your noes be noes. Why are you doing that? Well, she knew, but we also understand that if the word is in our heart, you don't have to swear on the Bible to make a point. You just let your words be true. Jesus says don't make vows, don't make sudden, rash vows. That doesn't mean that making a vow is a sin, though. Paul made a vow. I have heard some people say that Paul's vow was sinful, that he shouldn't have done that. I don't believe that it was. It was something that he did between him and God. He was not telling other people to do it. He wasn't binding that on other people. So that was fine. Romans 14 goes a great deal into that kind of freedom. It talks about days and holidays and things like that. But that would seem to fall under those principles. That if that's what a person does between them and God, then that's up to them, as long as you don't bind it on other people. And so we go back to this idea. Also in Deuteronomy, there's also another passage before I move on, in Numbers chapter 30. This has nothing to do with Jephthah, actually. But there are provisions by fathers and husbands that if they hear their daughter or they hear their wife make a vow that they do not approve of, they can just say, no, we're not doing that. But if they don't hear it, or if they allow it to stand, then the vow had to be had to take place. Now, with all of that being said, all of that could have played into it. He could have gone back and said, I know the law doesn't expect me to do this. We'll just consecrate her. But when you go back to Judges, it says that she goes up for those 2 months. And she, as I think the King James Version says, she mourns. Well, that's the English Standard. The King James says she bewails her virginity. So what does that mean? Well, how many children did Jephthah have? Just one. Just his daughter. She's not married. She has no children. Now, it's from our perspective of life, that doesn't mean as much. I mean, we all want children. Not everybody does. But in that culture, it was so important for your family to keep going forward. And so if Jephthah's daughter dies without children, then what does that mean for Jephthah's line? It's over. He has no one left. His line is done. That is a tragedy in ancient Hebrew thought. It still is a tragedy to us today, but not as heavy of one as it was to them. So either consecrated or sacrificed, his line was going to end one way or the other. When you go back to Judges, after the 2 months that she bewails her virginity or she mourns her virginity, doesn't have a husband, doesn't have children, her line is coming to an end. It does not say that he consecrates her to the tabernacle. What does it say that he does? That which he vowed. And when you go back to the ancient language, that which he vowed, the word is a burnt offering, which is translated perfectly in our English translations. He vowed to offer her as a burnt offering. The Bible says he did it. That does not mean, however, and we have to make sure that we understand these things, because sometimes I'll hear folks when they try to say, you people who believe the Bible are so foolish, and you think that that's a guide for you. It's so foolish. They'll bring up Lot's daughters. Because remember what happened with Lot's daughters. They got Lot drunk and seduced him, and they had children by him. In fact, one of his descendants is the enemy of Israel here that Jephthah's dealing with, and that's the Ammonites. Horrible, nasty people. But I'll hear people say, well, you're going to follow the Bible, and the Bible has this going on. Well, just because the Bible says something happened doesn't mean that I'm going to say, I'm going to do that. I'm going to do that very thing. These people are not always examples to us of what to do. In fact, oftentimes, they're examples for us of what not to do. So, Jephthah killing his daughter, making that vow, there does come a time where you've got to think, there are laws that are more important than other laws. The law of killing my daughter or another human being and a burnt offering, which is not something that God ever commands, nor, as he says in the prophets, that it ever entered my mind that you should do this thing. You've got to come back and say, this is not right. Now, some others have said, well, God doesn't say anything about it. He doesn't stop him. He doesn't condemn him. In fact, he just kind of lets it go. And so a lot of times people will say, well, since God let it go, he must have been approving of it. That is an argument from silence. How many times, perhaps, have you told your children to do or not do something, and they either do it when they're not supposed to, or they don't do it when they are supposed to? Has that ever happened to anyone who raised children? And sometimes we don't say anything about it for various reasons. I mean, it could be that you're wanting to see if they're going to correct themselves. Hopefully that's the situation. That's what I try to do. Sometimes, I'll be honest with you, in times past, it's not quite like this anymore as they're older. I want to see how much rope they need to hang themselves. Just because we're silent about something doesn't mean we give approval to it. God didn't give approval to this kind of thing. It was already written down. But Jephthah did it anyway. But then someone will say, well, let's go to Hebrews chapter 11. So let's go to Hebrews chapter 11. And what is Hebrews 11? Does anybody remember Hebrews 11? Yep, it's the Hall of Fame of Faith. And you've got all these men and women here. You've got all the way back to Noah. And For some reason, I forgot where Hebrews was. So you go all the way back to Noah. And I have heard, we're almost out of time, but I have heard people say, well, it seems a little bit out of place because when you get to the end of Hebrews 11, of all of these people that he mentions, he throws Jephthah in there. There in verse 32. He doesn't go into detail about Jephthah, but Jephthah is mentioned for his faith. And so someone would say, well, that seems out of place. And I think the correct answer to that is, does it? Does it seem out of place? Because when you go through Hebrews 11, it is not one of these passages where you're supposed to look at that and be like, I really need to be like Noah. I really need to be like this man or this woman. That's not what it's about. It's about the faith that they had in God. So it's not really about that person other than it's about their faith. It's more about God, what God does with their faith in spite of their sins and their flaws. Because think about it, you've got Abel. Now, we don't know any sinfulness in Abel because we don't have much about that, but he was offering sacrifices, which tells us something. And everybody has sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Then you go down through here, you have Enoch. We don't know anything about Enoch other than he was taken up by God because he walked with God, but it took 365 years before he gets to that point. So he obviously was a good man, but that doesn't mean he was sinless. Let's see. And then, of course, you got Hebrews 11:6. Without faith, it is impossible to please him. Whoever who would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. Noah was perfect in his generations. That's what the Bible says about Noah before God calls him to build the ark. When he says he's perfect in his generations, it does not mean that he is sinless. It means that compared to others, he's got his faith in God. He's following God. In fact, it says he walks with God. Let's see. Abraham, we already talked about Abraham, the things that he's done. Sarah, same thing. He said all these died in faith. He talks about Abraham for a little bit more. Moses. Well, let's think about Moses. What could Moses be labeled as before God calls him in the bush? He's a murderer. He killed that Egyptian man. Now some people like that would say, well, maybe that young man thought he was homeless. They might say, well, he was an Egyptian. He got what he had coming. In the words of Clint Eastwood in the movie Unforgiven, we all got it coming, kid. That does not hold any water. Everybody has it coming. And the only way to get out of what's coming is through Jesus. So Moses is a murderer. Also, not only that, but Moses, when he sees the bush on fire, what does he do? When God calls him and tells him to go back to Egypt, what's he do? I don't want to do this. And he makes excuse after excuse. He doesn't have faith at that point. We understand. Just by faith, the people crossed the Red Sea on dry land. What about those people? What about the people of Israel? By faith, they crossed the Red Sea on dry land, but up to that point and many years after that point, what did they do a lot of the times? They're complaining. And it's not just that they're complaining. I mean, you and I will complain about things, but these folks, they take complaining to a whole new level. It'd be better if we'd have just stayed in Egypt. Oh, the food there was so much better than the food here in the wilderness. I have no doubt. You go through the wilderness, you don't have nice gardens. But God's providing freedom for you, and he's going to make sure that you live. We don't have enough water. I understand, you get thirsty. But they constantly, it wasn't just saying, hey, Moses, can we have some water? It was, hey, Moses, are you trying to kill us? Is God trying to put us to an end? That showed a lack of faith. And yet, God in Hebrews says they had the faith to go through. Now, most of them didn't make it to the other side of the wilderness because of their disbelief and their hardness of heart. But there they had faith. Talked Talks about the walls of Jericho. Rahab. What would we say about Rahab? She has faith, and yet, what do we know about her? She's a prostitute. So when you got David, Samson. Samson was a womanizer, disobedient, in almost every way rebellious. David, I mean, you know what David did. Samuel didn't raise his children in God's ways. So when you think about all of those things, Jephthah doesn't seem so much out of place after all. Was what he did was right? No, it was wrong. He should not have done it. But one more thing as we close. Even though he was misdirected and misguided in his vow, he at least knew that if I make a vow to God, I need to take that seriously. And so he did. Doesn't mean that God was pleased with it or he approved of it, but that's what he thought he needed to do. Now, it is probable that because of that they were influenced by the Baal worshipers of Canaan, that there was some confusion, and he thought this is how they respond to their God and try to get his favor. Maybe that's the way you deal with our God too. I don't know. It's a tragic story and very disturbing. But in the end, we still see Jephthah was a man that did have a little bit of faith, and God kept his word to Jephthah despite Jephthah struggling there. I think there's a good lesson there for us as well. We're a little hard on ourselves sometimes, and I think that's okay. But at the end of the day, we have to remember God has forgiven us. If we're in Christ, God is forgiving us. He is working on us. And that's going to take a long time. And so we should never give up despite our tragic lack of faith from time to time, but just keep on moving forward. Does anyone have any questions or comments? I know we're out of time. That's true. Yes, I didn't think about that. That's a good observation. Very good. All right, thank you, everyone. We'll begin our worship service here in a few minutes.